So this is the prototype that we are working towards. In our last video, we added the tick marks on the side. In this video, let's add the plus and minus buttons, the current temperature, the title, and the mode icon. Now, the first thing I'm going to do here is add our current temperature. So I'm going to make a new container and call this box current temp, and I'm going to add some text. Now my text is not showing up because it's behind the mask. I'm just going to put currently 70 degrees, and the degree symbol again is Option Shift 8. But as soon as I click out of this, like I mentioned, it doesn't show up. That's because the text and the box that I just created are behind the mask that we created in the previous video. In order to overcome this, you can do that in two ways. First, you can drag the layers below the mask, and then they won't be hidden by the mask. But the second thing you can do is you can put the mask and anything that it is masking inside of another container. So I'm going to make another container, and I'm going to simply make it the same size as the container of the content that I want that is currently being masked. And then you just simply drag those elements inside of that container. I'm going to call this box masked ticks. Okay? Alright. Now we can work with our current temperature box. So let me put this text inside of my box temp. I'm going to label this current temp. Okay, I'm actually going to make that font San Francisco, and I'm going to make it 12 points, so it's going to be pretty small. I'm also going to resize it and align like this, and I want that to show up about over here. Alright, to put I want this current temperature to be inside of a box, so I'm going to make a rectangle. That rectangle is going to be white. I'm going to call that temp rectangle. Okay, and I'm going to make that a width of 100 with a height of 28. Okay. I'm also going to up the radius so that it has those rounded corners there. Alright, let me zoom in. Align these. Now, I want this to be a certain number of pixels from the edge, so I'm just going to bump it over to the edge and bring it out. That's 10, 20, about 20 pixels from the edge. And then I'm going to make another rectangle. So I'm just going to copy the one that I already have and paste it. Bring that out to the side. Going to remove the radius, and I'm going to make the origin in the middle and simply make the height of that 1 pixel. Okay? And now it looks like it is anchored to the side, indicating a specific position where 70 degrees will be. Alright, let me zoom out here, and I want this to actually be right at 70. So what I'm going to do is just drag it over to the other side where my tick marks are and just bump it down until it's exactly where I want it. Okay, and now I can drag it back over to that right side. Okay, now let's add our plus and minus buttons down here. So in order to do that, I'm going to create a container. And this container is going to be 44 by 44 points. And the reason why I'm using 44 is because that's the minimum recommended tap area for any button. And I'm going to label this container button plus. I'm going to copy and paste. This next one I'm going to name button minus. Let's just drag that below the plus. Okay, and I want these to be 8 points, have 8 point separation between them. And I want both of these to be 16 points from the edge. So I'm going to hold shift arrow, and that's going to give me 10, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there is 16 points from the edge. Okay, so I like to put all of my buttons in containers because then I can change the appearance of the buttons inside of them and just control the container itself. It makes it much easier. So I'm going to add a rectangle shape inside of button plus. All right. Let's label that, let's make that 44 points. And let's also bump up the radius so that it's a circle. I want it to be white. And I want the opacity to actually be 0. Because when we tap on the plus button right here, what I want to happen is to have this this background of the button to show up and to give an indicator that it has been tapped. So let's label this button plus background, which I abbreviate as BKG. Let's put it into button plus. Going to also make 2 more shapes to just create our plus sign. So that's going to be a width of 1 and a height of 20. So let's drag that in there. Let's bump up the radius, and let's also make it white. Now I'm going to copy that. I'm also, actually before I copy, I'm going to call this one line 1, and copy and paste. Call this one line 2, and I'll just go ahead and rotate it by 90 degrees. And drag that towards the middle to create our plus sign. Now, as I'm working with these, I'm going to lock my box slider and my app background so that I can more easily manipulate these without accidentally selecting the background. I'm going to select my line 1, line 2, and my button plus background, and use my align tools to make sure that they are centered. Now let's copy line 2 and the button plus background, Command C, and let's put them inside of our button minus container. So let's drag those inside of there, and you can move those down right inside of the button minus container. I'm going to rename these to button minus background, and just line 2 is fine. So now what I want to do is make the whole container be tappable, and we're going to make the background change its opacity for a moment to indicate that it's being tapped. So I'm going to add a trigger. This is actually going to be a touch down trigger, and when I touch down on button minus, I'm going to add a rule that's going to change the opacity of the minus background, and that opacity is going to change to 50%. So now we have a rule saying when I touch down on this button here, that circle background is going to reveal itself. But when I touch up, when I lift my finger off of it, I want that to go back down to 0. So let's go back and add a touch up trigger, an opacity, and that opacity is going to be 0. But the thing that needs to go down to 0 is the button minus background. Alright, so let's test that out. And as you can see, as I've touched down on it and I'm still holding down, when I lift up, it's going to fade back down to 0. Good. So let's do that same thing with the plus button. And so let's actually label these. So let's just touch down minus. And this is touch up minus. And I'm going to add a new trigger. This trigger is going to be touch down. And that's going to be for button plus. I'm going to add a rule here for the opacity. And I want that to apply to the button plus background, and that's going to go to 50%. And I'm going to add it, and I'm going to rename this to touch down plus. Now let's add another trigger, which is touch up, and that's going to be touch up on button plus, so that's good. And we'll add our rule for the opacity to go back down to 0, but not for button plus, but for the button plus background. So let's give that a test. So that's working, and that's working. Now let's actually add the rules that will make these bump our slider up or down. Let's zoom out here, and I'm going to add a new trigger, which is a tap, and I'm going to, what I want to tap is button plus, and the rule that I want to add to this tap is to move, and the thing that I want to move is the box slider, and I want to move by, because every time I tap it I want to move it up, up, up by a certain amount. The amount that I'm going to put is not the X value, because I don't want it to move side by side. I want it to move up by negative 15 points. So 0 is at the top, so every time I do negative 15, it's getting closer and closer to 0. And I'm going to name this trigger tap plus, and I'm going to add a new trigger. I'm going to call this one tap minus, and the thing I want to, the trigger itself is going to be that button minus, and I'm going to move by, and that Y is going to be 15 points. So let's give that a test. So every time I bump up, it's going to move our slider up, and it looks like I've chosen the wrong layer for moving the minus. So we don't want the minus to move, we want the slider to move. So let's go and fix that. We want it to be the box slider. There we go. Alright, so now when I tap that minus sign, my slider goes down. Okay, very good. Alright, now let's add our label up here. This label is going to be living room, because this is the thermostat for the living room. So I'm just going to add a text box up here. I'm going to call it living room, and I want that to be centered. I want it to be 17 points to follow kind of standard iOS guidelines. Let's make our font San Francisco text. And if you don't have San Francisco, you can use any font. That's fine. And we're going to add an image here of a flame to indicate that this is in heat mode. So let's do that. I'm actually going to go to Safari, open a new tab, and I'm going to type in nounproject.com. So this is a website that has icons for any purpose. I'm just going to type in flame, and I'm going to scroll through here and just see all of the available icons for flames, and see if there are any that I like, that I think will work with my project. And I'm going to use this one right here. So you just click get this icon. This is going to be a basic download because we don't need to pay for the extra license in this case. And I'm just going to say this is for a let's call it an art project. I'm going to choose that use, and I'm going to download that SVG. Now I'm going to take that SVG and I'm actually going to drag it into Adobe Illustrator. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to delete the attribution. I'm going to make this bounding box square, so let's make it 100 by 100. And I want this to be the same color as my orange over here. So let me go back to ProtoPie and let's unlock my slider layer. Tap on the slider and copy the hex value. Now we just go to Fill in Illustrator and paste that hex value in there. And I'm going to go to File, Export. I'm going to save for web just to make it easy. And I want to keep the transparency. I'm just going to click Save, and I want to save that inside of my project right here. I'm going to call it Flame. Save, and I'm going to replace what I have in there. And now I don't need Illustrator anymore, so I'm going to quit Illustrator. I'm going to open up Finder. Locate that file that I just saved, drag that into my project. And I'm going to also put this against the edge and move it 16 pixels in. Okay, so now we have our project over here, and one thing that I want to do is have these elements on the screen just disappear as I'm dragging, so that I can really focus on this micro interaction. So instead of going through each of these elements and making them all disappear individually, what I'm going to do is create a container. Going to call this box elements. I'm going to drag it over here on the right hand side, and what I'm going to do is just drag the elements I just created into that container. Alright, so now they're all in that container. Now all I need to do is animate this container, and all of the elements will animate with it. So we already have a trigger for touching down on the slider, so I'm going to go to that interaction right here. Just for clarity, I'm going to name it slider and touch up slider. And I'm going to go back down to touchdown slider and add an opacity rule, and that's going to bring the opacity to 0. And the thing that I want to disappear is box elements. And now when I touch up, when I lift my finger up off the slider, I want to add an opacity for that. And that's going to bring that opacity back to 100. Okay, so let's give that a try. So there we go. Now it looks like all of the elements disappeared except for my flame. So let's actually take that flame and drag that also into box elements. And I felt like the opacity it changed a little bit too quickly. So what I'm going to do is actually make the duration of that 0.4 on both of these. Alright. In this case, it's okay to go a little bit longer because it's not something the user is really waiting for in order to complete an action. It's just an extra kind of animation to add to the look and feel of the interface itself. Alright, so there we go. When I lift up, those elements show up. When I press down, they disappear. Good. So I think that's a good place to pause, and I'll see you in the next video.